Hello from San Francisco. I'm Anand Naidu and welcome to a special edition of The Heat. All week long, we will be bringing you extensive coverage of the APEC Economic Leaders Meeting, including the visit of Chinese President Xi Jinping and his upcoming talks with US President Joe Biden. Over the next several days, leaders from the 21-member Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation economies will gather here in San Francisco. This is the 30th APEC Economic Leaders Meeting, and China's President Xi Jinping will be attending. He will meet with US President Joe Biden for a China-US summit. I talked earlier with a distinguished panel about the potential impact of the talks. Joining me from Beijing is Victor Ga. He is chair professor at Soochow University. Also with us from Boston is Jorge Heine. He is a former Chilean ambassador to China. And from New York, joining us too is Robert Hormats. He is a visiting lecturer at Yale University, and he's a former US Undersecretary of State. Welcome to all of you to the show. Victor Gao, Chinese President Xi Jinping, as well as the United States President Joe Biden, are expected to be there at the APEC Leaders Meeting. And it's also expected that President Xi and President Biden will hold a bilateral meeting on the sidelines of this gathering. The last time, in fact, these two leaders met was last November at the G20 meeting in Bali. The fact that they're meeting right now at APEC for a bilateral meeting, how significant is that?
I think it is highly probable that the President Biden of the United States and the Chinese President Xi Jinping will meet on the sideline of the APEC summit in San Francisco. And the two sides are now making full preparation for this important summit. And I think the Biden-Xi summit will really steal a lot of show from the APEC meeting, because the world is watching how these two leaders will deal with each other, whether they can reach some agreement, whether they can take some pressure off from the China-US relations. And I do hope President Biden will not break this record of each president in the United States since President Reagan visiting China in a presidential state visit. That means I hope in the first half of 2024, President Biden will visit China as the US president in a presidential visit, and likewise, the Chinese president will reciprocate by making a state visit to the United States. These full state visits between China and the United States will be more befitting for these two largest economies in the world. And it is time for China and the United States to deal with each other as an equal, look at each other and coordinate many things for mutual benefit.
Robert Hormats, the United States, as Victor pointed out, has been laying the groundwork for this bilateral meeting. Over the past few months, we've seen a whole string of American leaders go to Beijing. We had the Chinese foreign minister visit the United States as well. I mean, this relationship has been going through a tough period, but do you think the fact that the two leaders will be meeting in San Francisco is a signal that there's going to be a serious attempt now to ease tensions in the relationship and a serious effort to improve relations?
Yes, I do. I think that the fact that there have been these cabinet visits by American cabinet members of high level to China, and the Chinese foreign minister came here to Washington and had numerous talks and a number of conversations with high-level Americans, including the president, is a signal that both sides understand that while there are major differences between them, there is also a need to manage those differences in a constructive way, in a peaceful way, in a mutually beneficial way, and that there are several issues that affect both countries and the world that require the support of the heads of state and the initiatives of the heads of state to move forward on. Cooperation on health issues is important. Cooperation on environmental issues is important. The world has a number of financial challenges in many parts of the world. Last time, the United States and China, 2008, cooperated on those. So I think there are ways of, first of all, managing the current differences and divisions, but also ways of identifying new areas where both sides can cooperate to a greater degree. And that, as we know from the past, I started going to China during the Nixon administration when I worked for Kissinger. I learned one thing, and that is things happen between China and the U.S. that would not happen unless the two heads of state can initiate them and move them forward and give them the kind of domestic support that they need and the international support they need.
Ambassador Heine, as Victor Gar told us a moment ago, it's possible, likely, that the bilateral talks will overshadow the leaders' meeting itself. The world will be watching this very closely, and there's much going on in the world right now. We've got two major conflicts. There are economic challenges as well. What are your expectations from the meeting between President Xi and President Biden?
Well, I heard what my good friend Victor Gao said, and his hopes about that this will be followed by state visit by President Biden to China next year, and also perhaps a state visit by President Xi to the United States in 2024. I will say, much as I would like that to see happen, I am not sure it is in the cards. Let us not forget that 2024 is an election year in the United States. It's an election year in Taiwan. There's much going on that doesn't necessarily facilitate such an exchange of visits. So my take is the following. I would take advantage of the fact that the two leaders will be meeting for the first time since Bali, and that they should make the most of this meeting. It may be on the sidelines of APEC, but it is very important, and it is not conducive to enhance the state of global affairs that China and the U.S. only deal with crisis. They should have a regular exchange of views. That has been facilitated by the recent visits of various U.S. cabinet secretaries to Beijing, the recent visit by Foreign Minister Wang Yi to Washington. And so I would try to make the most of this particular meeting, and perhaps look for another bilateral meeting at another summit that takes place in the year 2024. I would not raise expectations about an exchange of state visits in 2024, much as I would like that to happen. The main thing is to put the things that are needed on the table and try to resolve as many of them as possible on this particular occasion. Hopefully some deliverables as well.
Victor, there's been a great deal of turmoil in recent years on trade issues, particularly on the tariffs that were imposed by former President Donald Trump. And I hope that President Biden would change course, didn't materialize. Those tariffs are still in place. Do you think this bilateral meeting that's going to take place between the two leaders will change that? That we'll see some progress that'll go some way towards stabilizing the trade relationship in some kind of win-win scenario?
Yes, I do hope so, because the tariffs imposed by President Trump on Chinese exports to the United States was one of the reasons why the inflation rate in the United States remained very high. And the tariffs were not paid by China. They were paid by the American consumers and the importers. Therefore, it will be absolutely right for China and the United States to reduce, if not lift, all these trade tariffs against each other. And I would even recommend that the two countries would aim to boost their bilateral trade volume from currently about $700 billion to $1 trillion. And the U.S. will need to export more to China. So eventually, the bilateral trade between China and the United States will be more balanced. I think the fact that China is starting to import lots of grain from the United States in preparation for the summit meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping is also a positive factor. And I would say the Chinese market has unlimited potential to import much and many of the U.S. Products of all kinds, affordable and good quality, for example, and that will help create many jobs in the United States. And this is the positive, right thing for China and the United States to do. We should avoid getting at each other's jugular. We should think more about how to maximize the benefits for the American people on the one hand and for the Chinese people. And I do hope the Biden-Xi Jinping summit in San Francisco will go a big mile in the right direction.
Robert, as we were reminded just a moment ago, next year is a presidential election here, right here in the United States. No doubt China will be part of the campaigns, will be part of the debate in the run-up to that election. There's some very hardline positions on China, as we know, especially in the United States Congress. Do you think the fact that those hardline positions exist is going to limit how much President Biden can do?
Unfortunately, the answer is probably yes, that there are a lot of hardline positions on both sides, Republicans and Democrats alike. And I think this will impose certain limits on how far the president thinks he can go when he's looking over his shoulder at the domestic political constituencies that he has to deal with in the coming elections. On the other hand, I would also say that as a leader, as a president, he also would benefit from developing with President Xi some constructive ideas that demonstrate that both sides can benefit from a closer relationship, that both sides can benefit from working together on environmental issues, can benefit from working together on health and medical collaboration, which we have done for decades, and it's benefited Chinese and Americans. That both sides can benefit from improving the global trading system because we both heavily depend on it. So I think he has to be wary of his political constituents at home, but also find ways of demonstrating to Americans that China and the U.S. have certain things that they both can gain from closer cooperation, and certainly both can be harmed if we have further development tensions, which can hurt both sides. So he has to thread the needle in a way, but I think he can come out with a constructive outcome that is good for Chinese-U.S. relations and also does not rattle his domestic constituency in a negative way.
Ambassador Heine, Chile is a member of APEC, so what will Chile be expecting from the leaders' meeting?
Well, Chile is concerned about the fact that APEC has not been showing the dynamism that it had in previous years. And, to give you only an example, Chile was supposed to host the 2019 APEC summit. As you may recall, there was, an uprising in Chile, and the meeting had to be canceled. Now, what often happens with that meeting is that they are rescheduled, but it gives you an idea of how weak APEC has become, that it wasn't rescheduled. So the 2019 APEC summit simply wasn't held. Now, that tells you a lot about, it seems to me, the situation in which APEC finds itself. Now, the Asia-Pacific is the most dynamic and fastest growing area in the world. There's much to be said to give a new impetus to trade across the Pacific. And, if I were President Biden and President Xi, quite apart from their bilateral meeting, I would try to give this new impetus to APEC so that it can be again, the significant motor of global trade that it was for many years. So it seems to me it is important for APEC to recover that dynamism that it had. This is the 30th anniversary of the APEC summit. APEC was founded in 1989, but the first leader summit was held in 1993. It's the first time the U.S. hosted since 2011. So there are all sorts of reasons why this, is a significant meeting. And it seems to me leaders should take advantage of that and try to give it a new impetus. The world needs more of APEC, not less of it.
Victor, I just want to get back for a moment to the political dynamics of this bilateral meeting. As we just talked a moment ago about the fact that President Biden will be keeping a close eye on domestic politics when he meets with President Xi, and a lot that comes out of that meeting will be determined by the domestic political situation in the United States. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, indeed, in Washington, there is increasing a level of anti-China rhetorics as well as activities. This is truly a dangerous sign that we all need to be guarded against. On the other hand, I truly believe China is not an enemy of the United States, and the American decision makers and politicians of all kinds need to look at China as it is. China cooperated with the United States very closely back in 2008 in preventing the escalation of the global international financial crisis. China and the United States can act together to do wonderful things in the coming years, as well as to prevent major disasters from happening. This is the real test of what China is. And I hope the American decision makers will realize that China is a force for good. It's a force that can be generated and used for the benefit of the American people. And China-US close cooperation will be positive for both the Chinese people as well as the American people. This should be viewed as the megatrend for the world in the coming decades, rather than, for example, China and the United States should face a zero-sum game and each one should scheme to hold down the other side.
And Victor, looking at this from the Chinese point of view, I mean, China has long been a very strong proponent of open trade, of investment. It's championed globalization, it's championed multilateralism. So what do you think is the overall message that China will be bringing to APEC?
I think China believes that globalization is not going to be disrupted. It should be further promoted for the benefit of all the participating countries. And China has also put a premium on connectivity projects of all kinds. And I think China also believes that between China and the United States, we can cooperate on a much more extensive way. And China also believes that China-US positive relations will be a stabilizing factor for the whole world, especially when mankind are faced with a major crisis in different parts of the world. So I think China's spirit brought to the APEC meeting in San Francisco is free trade, market economy, and cooperation of all kinds, connectivity, and better relations between China and the United States for the benefit of mankind as a whole.
Robert Hormats, as of 2021, APEC members make up 7 of the top 10 overall trading partners of the United States. Do you see any overall or significant expansion in U.S. trade relations with the member countries of APEC?
Well, I do. I think that there is a general feeling in the United States that in some cases, in some parts of the political system, there's a negative view on trade. But among most Americans who are involved in the economy, in the farm community, the technology community, the entertainment community, the financial community, manufacturing community, there's a recognition that the U.S. cannot succeed unless it has a robust domestic economy, but also a robust foreign trade policy where it takes advantage of opportunities to work with and cooperate closely with other countries to broaden market access. And to do that, the United States also has to recognize that it has to maintain a very open, fair, transparent trading system as well. And that means for Asia and for the rest of the world. So I think President Biden is going to recognize that while there are difficulties at home and there are difficulties in relationship with China, there also is a compelling need among Americans, and particularly people who want jobs in some of the newer technologies and newer areas, that we resolve trade issues in a constructive way. And I think Secretary Raimondo, who was in China very recently, indicated that while in some areas there might be tough restrictions, in other areas there were good opportunities, and that we had to sort these out. And she's had set up meetings between Chinese and American businesses and Chinese and American officials. And I think one of those goals has to be to identify trade barriers that are mutually harmful, and many of them that we have put up against China under the Trump administration really are harmful to large numbers of Americans, and they've made that point known. And I think if President Biden is in a position to do so, he can make the argument to certain groups that lowering certain barriers to China and to other countries can actually benefit American consumers and benefit American businesses, particularly American businesses that use foreign components. So it's a complicated mix, but if you tell the story and you have the right narrative, you can deal with some of the tougher issues, but you can also make progress in some of the areas where mutual benefit is possible and is demonstrable.
Ambassador Heine, of course, China is involved in a major way, is engaging in a major way with the countries of Latin America. What do you see ahead for Asia-Pacific cooperation in terms of the economies of those countries and trade?
Well, I will say this. Latin America has been going through some very difficult moments through the pandemic, through its big economic downturn in 2020. And the countries are really looking forward to expand their international trade and, their international investment. So for countries in Latin America, it is very important to have more trade with the United States, but also with China and other countries around the world. But obviously, the United States and China are the two biggest economies. So it is very important that can be expanded. President Biden just hosted something called the APEC meeting with 12 countries in the Americas in Washington last week, and that is an encouraging sign. And several countries in Latin America, of course, have free trade agreements with China. So there are some encouraging elements there, but we need a lot more of that.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
The APEC meetings in San Francisco will also include a major gathering of CEOs and other business leaders. For more on that and overall expectations for APEC Week, I talked with the president of the National Center for APEC, Monica Whaley. Monica, thanks so much for joining us. This is a major gathering. The 21 member economies of APEC will be in San Francisco. They account for 38% of the global population and about 62% of GDP and almost half of global trade. So what are your expectations?
Well, it's good. Thank you, first of all, for having me here today. And we are very excited about the CEO Summit that's going to be happening this week in tandem with the APEC Leaders Meeting, and excited about all of the different bilateral meetings that are going to be happening, as well as all of the business announcements that are going to be made this week at the APEC CEO Summit. We're going to have 1,000 delegates, many of them global CEOs from across the region, and delighted that we have a great distribution of economies represented here at APEC at the CEO Summit as well.
Now, the United States is hosting APEC. It's the first time it's doing so since 2011. It's chosen the theme, creating a resilient and sustainable future for all. What do you see as some of the key areas of discussion in the coming days?
Well, obviously, the issue of sustainability is going to be paramount for all of us here, as it is across the globe, it seems, at most multilateral fora. And the APEC one is no different. There's going to be a Sustainable Future Forum that is going to focus on the ways that the private sector can partner with governments and other NGOs and business to address some of the challenges facing the globe in the areas of climate and sustainability. There's also going to be a strong effort to address inclusion, both inclusion of women and women's economic empowerment, other underserved communities throughout the APEC region. I think that inclusion piece is going to be woven throughout the APEC agenda. We also have at the CEO Summit a focus on both resilience and innovation. Of course, we're meeting in San Francisco, which is a hub of innovation, and really the AI revolution is really starting here, and we're looking forward to learning more about all of those things at the APEC CEO Summit sessions.
Right, and in terms of economic cooperation, what can we expect from the leaders' meeting?
Well, they're still talking, so we don't know exactly what's going to be the outcomes, but we do anticipate that there's going to be a discussion of the Pacific Digital Agenda as well as the sustainability agenda. And leaders are talking about a lot of initiatives between, anti-corruption is one issue on the agenda. We've got a number of announcements being made between the private sector and public sector, announcements of private sector initiatives that are being done in partnership with the governments to address a huge array of different issues in the region that support this idea of creating economic opportunity, building economic resilience.
Well, let's talk a little bit about APEC. I mean, it was formed in 1989. It was
Yes.
An informal forum at that time, which was to promote regional economic integration. But the world has changed a lot since then, of course. China is now the world's
Indeed.
second largest economy. So how will all that impact what is going to be taking place?
What I think is exciting about the progression of APEC over the years, as you're absolutely correct, it began as a ministerial gathering back in '89. In 1993, which was the first time the U.S. hosted, that was raised and elevated to the leaders level. And that meeting was held in Seattle and was, in fact, the genesis of the creation of the National Center for APEC to focus on private sector interaction with the APEC process. And in the intervening years to 2011, the APEC Business Advisory Council was created. And there was ever greater integration of private sector discussions in the APEC process. And this is where the CEO Summit really is the kind of the culmination of each year's focus on the private sector interactions with APEC. So it really is unique in amongst multilateral fora in that respect, that this dialogue between the governments and the private sector exists. And there are a number of different stakeholders that have various kinds of interactions with the APEC officials. This channel for business has been established since at least since 1986. There was always an element of it, but now the APEC Business Advisory Council makes it more formal, and the APEC CEO Summit, which happens every year.
Now, as you say, it started out as a ministerial meeting and was elevated to the leaders meeting that we are seeing right now. But you talked a lot about the CEOs being in San Francisco as well. So would it be fair to say then there's going to be a strong private sector component guiding the discussions there?
Well, the discussions happen in parallel to one another. So the APEC CEO Summit happens and the leaders address the CEO Summit and come over and engage with the CEOs. The leaders, though, have their own agenda, their own policy agenda, obviously, in their own meeting and their own leaders retreat. So there is the policy side, the governmental side, so to speak, and then the private sector interaction side. But the private sector interaction side is really the part that most of the world actually sees. They're the sessions that are recorded and broadcast, and we're lucky to have partners like CGTN that help us get the word out everywhere. And so this is something that we focus on, just the business side of it from my organization's perspective. But this is really a culmination of a whole year's worth of official interactions, including 10 ministerial meetings that have happened over the course of the year in Detroit and in Seattle earlier this year. And there will continue to be some more ministerial meetings here on the ground before leaders arrive. The meeting of the finance ministers and meeting of trade and foreign ministers jointly happens just before the leaders meeting. So there's a strong parallel government component, and we do APEC at the National Center for APEC year in and year out. So it's not just a November sort of phenomenon.
Monica, thanks so much for joining us. And that's it for this special edition of The Heat from San Francisco. Please join us throughout the week as we bring you more in-depth coverage of the APEC meetings. I'm Anand Naidu. Thanks for joining us.
From sustainability and digitalization to trade, health, and energy security, 21 major Asian-Pacific economies gather to address the most pressing global challenges and to create a future of sustainable economic growth. Join CGTN for our coverage of APEC 2023.
Washington.